mortgage markets and more. I'm your host, Peter D'Angelo. Welcome to Monday. I hope you had a great weekend. We've got your mortgage rate update ready to go here. Before I start, though, just wanted to take a brief moment for a public service announcement. If you are interested in purchasing, I highly recommend you go through the pre-approval process as soon as possible, even if you don't plan on purchasing for a year. If you think that part of your financial plan will be to buy a home in the next 12 months, don't wait. The market is moving quickly, and getting pre-approved early will benefit you by getting you prepared, first and foremost. Secondly, if there's anything that can be done in between now and when you do intend to be a serious buyer, there may be things you can do to better position yourself. And the only way to understand how to do that is to get pre-approved. I'll get off my soapbox now. That was my one little PSA for today. Now let's start talking about the mortgage rates. And guess what? I got good news. I got good news for you today for the first time in a little bit, over a month actually. We're just going to go through the numbers of the mortgage rates, what they were by the end of last week on average, and then we'll get into the why. Why did the mortgage rates move in the direction that they did? Starting things off with the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. This is all, by the way, from the Mortgage News Daily website's survey of mortgage rates throughout the country. I like this. To me, it seems to be indicative of a better average based on my experience in doing business and where these averages seem to line up. The 30-year conventional mortgage fixed rate was at 6.85% for last week. Then we had the FHA 30-year fixed rate mortgage was at 6.38%. The 30-year VA was at 6.4%. Again, that is a particular loan program available to our veterans. So that is exclusively for veterans from military service. The 15-year fixed rate mortgage was at 6.39%, and the 30-year jumbo was at 7.22%. So all of these rates are the lowest that they've been in over a month now, except for one, which is jumbo, and that still is quite a bit higher than it has been, and definitely over, the middle range of the past 52 weeks of where that mortgage rate has been settling for the average. You're probably wondering why. Why did this happen? This is great news, Pete, but why did this happen? Last week, Federal Chairman Jerome Powell testified to Congress, and this happens twice a year. So he goes and he discusses the Federal Reserve's position on the economy, reviews their monetary policy, fields questions from lawmakers. What came through in his 2 days of testimony was essentially that we're not far away from our 2% inflation target. That's music to everyone's ears, because then that means we're going to start focusing on when the Fed will cut their interest rate. More to the point on that, Chairman Jerome Powell pretty much said, and I'm summarizing here, but pretty much indicated that rate cuts can and will happen because we are making the proper progress. Things can change, but as of right now, and the trend of the data and where the data is now by way of the inflation data, by the jobs reports, by everything that affects the Federal Reserve's positioning and their consideration of their monetary policy, all these things are lining up. Beyond that, his quote directly was, quote, "We are in the right place." This gives us the impression that given their monetary policy, how they've been managing the federal fund rate, the discount rate for the past couple of years since inflation reared its ugly head and peaked, seems to be working now. And they are feeling confident that they are going to be reaching their 2% target soon and that cuts will be happening. Beyond that, he also made mention that essentially they don't see a recession on the horizon, which is great news for the economy. And there is some concern about empty office space. And I know it sounds weird. You're like, wait, how is empty office space affecting anything? Banks, particularly regional banks, will lend to those landlords, the people who own those office buildings. And if there's vacancy there, that can present an issue. We talk about fixed rate mortgages, and I'll just take a brief moment to talk about what does commercial lending look like. I'm not an expert in commercial lending, but I do know enough to be dangerous, so I will just share this. It's very rare that you have fixed rate loans for commercial, which now means that when there may be a fixed period to the financing, but then when that period expires, then it refreshes to the new rate. And sometimes you can refinance and get a better rate, but otherwise we have an elevated rate environment now. Particularly if you look back the past 2 years, a lot of commercial loans go 5 years for the introductory period, and then it adjusts. If that's the case, then a lot of these banks are exposed to landlords that have empty office space, and now the financing that underlies that building is becoming much more costly. That presents a risk to the banks. And if that's a risk to the banks, that's a risk to the economy. This is why that was made mention during the testimony. I thought it was just worthwhile to point that out and bring that up. This is great news. However, we want to also know why. What would give our Federal Reserve Chairman the confidence to make this type of testimony? Here are the things he's looking at. For the smart kids in class, we talk about the personal consumption expenditure. That is the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation gauge. That came in. The January data is in now, and we saw that the PCE, personal consumption expenditure, showed 2.4% increase year over year. That means the cost of things increased 2.4%. That's striking distance of our 2% inflation target. That's why. We also talked about how they kind of do the math and pull out some pieces, particularly food and energy costs, because they can be more volatile. So when they remove that PCE looks more like 2.8% year over year. And both of those numbers are better than December of 2023. However, not so much better. That means, oh man, we're really making progress toward our 2% inflation target. So it's still good news, not great news, but enough to give the Federal Reserve confidence that we're making the right moves, we're making the right progress for inflation, and rate cuts very likely now are going to happen this year. A rate cut for the Fed means a lower cost lending environment across all platforms, whether it's mortgages, car loans, credit cards, the whole nine. But also, if you're someone who uses CDs for savings and puts money in liquid savings accounts, online banks, that means your savings rate will wind up going down as well. So a little bit of a catch-22, but where we're sitting and what we're talking about for mortgages, we're really trying to see affordability increase for home buyers so that they can purchase and so that people who would be selling their homes will feel confident in selling their homes, and it could be a little bit more palatable selling their home that has a 3%, 4% interest rate for a home that has maybe 6% or 5.5%. And if we get to that level, that could open up inventory, which would just wind up helping. A rising tide raises all ships. Other things that the Federal Reserve looks at, as we've talked about in the past, are things like the unemployment rate. We got that for February, and that was at 3.9%, a slight tick up. This means that, okay, the economy is doing well, is resilient, but having a little tick up in the unemployment rate does give the Fed more confidence that they can cut rates to give a little bit of a stimulatory effect to the economy without the risk of inflation starting to jump back up again. We also got the job openings on Friday last week. This is the JOLTS, Job Openings Labor Turnover Survey, and that was relatively flat. So not good news, not bad news, but in my opinion, that's good news. We're not seeing a spike, an increase in job openings or turnovers, so that's good. And on Wednesday, just before that, we got the ADP, this is the payroll provider, they provide their report, and that showed 140,000 new jobs, which was an increase from 111,000 in January, but still below the analysts' expectations. The Dow Jones was expecting around 150,000 new jobs added, and it came in at 140,000. In this case, if it comes under expectation, that's great. That's great news. All of these things are setting the stage for the Fed to very likely cut interest rates, and therefore the markets are trading in line with that. We've talked in the past about how 30-year mortgage rates heavily tied to the 10-year mortgage or 10-year treasury bond, and that went up a bit in February. Now we're seeing it close to 4%. And if we can get that 10-year to dip below 4%, now we're going to start seeing even better mortgage rates. Right now, what we would call this situation is resistance. There's some resistance at 4% for that yield to go down. Hopefully, maybe in the next couple weeks, I'll definitely have an update for you next week and we could track this together. But we're just a scotch above 4% right now in the 10-year. I'll give you an update on that next week as well. We were talking about rate cuts. So before I close out, let's also understand one thing. Rate cuts stimulate the economy. And the reason why this has been such a tricky thing to navigate for the Fed in particular is if they cut interest rates too soon, inflation comes back. I probably sound like a broken record, but this is a very important concept. Right now, as of March 1st, 2024, the S&P 500, which is in the stock market, it's an index, it's a collection of the 500 companies that are at the creme de la creme in the equities market, in the stock market. The S&P 500 had 15 record closes in 2024 in essentially 2 months. That doesn't signal to me that the economy is in need of stimulating. And if we keep having these record closes, it could make the decision for the Fed a little bit more tricky because the economy looks to be doing very well, albeit there's a portion of stocks that are leading the way in that, but it's 6.5% up year to date through March 1st. That's a pretty strong market. So that's why this is a little bit difficult and complex as far as managing when to cut the interest rates. And it's a very fine line. If inflation hits 2%, if we see that come down, inflation hits 2%, the unemployment rate ticks up a little bit, we could very well see us hitting a recession. But given the fact that the testimony last week by Chairman Jerome Powell was that we're not seeing a recession on the horizon, they're going to be managing themselves prudently, gives a lot more hope for a mid-year rate cut. Not March. We're in March now. It's not happening. It didn't happen. It's not going to happen. However, very likely that we could see a rate cut by mid-year, and that can maybe help us out in the summer market. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this helpful and useful. I encourage you to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. Reach out to me if there's anything you want to hear about in particular. Would love your feedback. And please share the show with anybody who's in real estate or interested in real estate or not in real estate and just wants to stay on top. I am doing my very best to share the best information every Monday and Friday for you for your consideration. I will be back on Friday with a real estate update. Until then, make it an awesome week and take good care.